Released on December 20 of 1996, Wild Arms is a classic turn-based RPG developed by company Media Vision. It was localized to North America on April 30, 1997 and October of 1998 in Europe. Despite being overshadowed by the colossus that was Final Fantasy VII, Wild Arms still attained both critical and commercial success worldwide. And as we already know, it spawned several sequels and spin-offs, becoming a media franchise of its own. So today we are going to look into 10 things you probably didn't know about Wild Arms. Number 10. It was going to be an action RPG. Wild Arms was the third game developed by newly founded company Media Vision in 1996. Their first game was Crime Crackers, an action RPG released in 1994 for the PS1, exclusive to Japan. However, it was more of a first-person shooter with RPG elements, which was quite original for its time. 3 years later, once again only Japan will get its sequel. Their second game was Rapid Reload, a 2D run-and-gun game released in both Japan and Europe in 1995. Fantastic game, by the way. It was never released in North America. Their third game was Wild Arms. All these three games were published by Sony themselves, while Media Vision acted more like a subsidiary despite actually not being one. It was formed by ex-employees of the Riot division of Telenet Japan back in 1993. A deal with Sony was made then to start releasing their first games for the PlayStation. So having experience in shooters already, Media Vision thought they could make a role-playing game with a traditional style but with combat that was real-time action, specifically with guns, as they were clearly fans of spaghetti westerns. So it was decided to formulate the idea and present it to Sony as, once again, a shooter action RPG. However, Sony had other plans back then. Number 9. Final Fantasy Arms. In the mid-90s, there were already several JRPG publishers and developers. The most famous ones were Squaresoft, Enix, Capcom, and Konami. Sony wanted to compete against that, but just not with an action RPG. They wanted something traditional to enter the market with their own IP. So once MediaVision presented their project in 1995, Sony gave them the green light, which would also serve to promote the PlayStation itself. It barely had any RPGs released for it back then, and Squaresoft's huge title was just around the corner, Final Fantasy VII. It will be quite an ordeal to compete against that, but like I said, there were barely any JRPGs back then on the PlayStation, so Wild Arms had an advantage. However, Sony couldn't risk it with an action RPG, so MediaVision changed their ideas to the turn-based combat we got, implementing the arms, which were basically the guns of the main character. The game also had fantasy ideas in a world with some small steampunk elements and science fiction, pretty similar to Final Fantasy VII. Wild Arms was also influenced, however, by spaghetti westerns and was released late in December of 1996. A month later, however, Final Fantasy VII came out and of course it sold way more, but thankfully Wild Arms survived, was met with commercial success, and it went on to become its own series. Number 8. Influences. I mentioned the fact most fans already know that the game and its designers were fans of spaghetti westerns, which were funnily called in Japan as macaroni westerns. Some fans will probably know this too, but others may not, and that is the influence of Trigun. It was a manga that was serialized from 1995 to 1997, precisely during the Wild Arms time. It also got an animated series in 1998, which was commercially successful. Trigun was a big thing in Japan, precisely for having several influences, some of them involving old westerns. It's about an outlaw that is constantly being chased by bounty hunters since he has an outrageous bounty on his head. Well, Wild Arms isn't exactly the same, but it does follow three adventurers who travel the world while clashing with an organization after them. As for bounty hunters and outlaws, you'd have to play the game to understand, as this is a spoiler-free video. Wild Arms was produced by Takashi Fukushima and designed by Akifumi Kaneko, with music composed by Michiko Naruke. All three fans of, well, macaroni westerns. especially Naruke, with yet another big influence on the game for its music. Number 7. The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. Another interesting trivia about Wild Arms that most fans already know is the origin of its theme, famous music composed by legendary Ennio Morricone for the movie of The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, influenced our game designers. Michiko Naruke was a big fan and wanted to create a similar theme for Wild Arms, but one that will also represent the sense of adventure in a gratifying way. Even though the game also had some fantasy, steampunk and sci-fi elements involved, the world of Gaia was created to resemble the wasteland look of some old westerns. In the movie, we see the characters in various locations surrounded by vast deserts, something that we also see in Wild Arms, becoming even more prominent, however, in Wild Arms 3. The movie and its music influenced Naruke up to the point of influencing the script of the game, which was written by Akifumi Kaneko, who also was the lead designer. Number 6. Ancient Relic Machines. Some fans may or may not know what ARMS mean. For the longest time, even after the first 2 games had been released, most people didn't know. Supposedly, it was an acronym that stood for Ancient Relic Machines. It makes sense considering that's pretty much what the guns Rudy uses in the game are, weapons that are powerful relics of an ancient civilization. All details are explained much better in the game itself, of course. What you probably don't know is that this might be BS. That's right, the term Ancient Relic Machines apparently was a mistranslation from Japanese fans to the rest of the world. Neither Sony nor Mediavision, its developers, have ever confirmed this. In fact, during the years in between Wild Arms 3 and 4, the capital letters of ARMS used for advertisement outside of Japan were reverted back to normal to kill off the confusion. So Wild Arms apparently was always just that, ARMS. No acronym at all, just ARMS as in guns, and that's it. But no one knows for sure if the name was wrongfully advertised in the localization, or if it was made on purpose and the developers changed their minds afterwards. Number 5. Toys, Manga and Anime. It's hard to believe nowadays considering this franchise is pretty much dead, but Wild Arms was huge during its first years. Sony really wanted to rub in everyone's faces that they now had their own JRPG IP to compete against the giants. So Wild Arms not only got a video game but also a bunch of toys, a manga, an anime series, and it was even featured in another anime called The Great Teacher Onizuka. It's pretty much one of the games the main character has finished. The manga was called Hana no Subido, translated as Flower Thieves. An anime was also released which was called Twilight Venom with 22 episodes. Compilations of it were on DVD and the first one was even called The Good, the Bad and the Greedy. However, all this media was released after Wild Arms 2 had also been released. The anime ran from October of 1999 to March of 2000, while Wild Arms 2 had just been published in Japan. Its events are standalone and don't follow the ones in the games, though they are more connected to Wild Arms 2. The manga was released until 2001 actually, once again with its own characters and story connected to the first games. There were also soundtracks, albums, toys like I mentioned, and even small mobile spin-offs based on the series, all of them being Flash games. Number 4. The Gaia Confusion. Over the years, fans have asked themselves the same question: does every game take place in the same Gaia? It's true that all Wild Arms take place in a world with that name, as seen in the very first one, but does every sequel revolve around the same place? The answer is yes. Nevertheless, the developers shared some insight, saying that Gaia is a big world with many continents all around. Unfortunately, that's all they said. Pretty vague. It didn't really clarify things, especially not since every Wild Arms feels completely standalone in terms of everything. However, some cameos from characters of previous games can be sometimes seen, which definitely opens the possibility of what the developer said. One world, just different continents, similar to the Suikoden series but nowhere near as connected. Well, now you know it all started with this little gem on the PS1, but you also now know that this was planned as a series from the start. Wild Arms was never supposed to be just one game. Number 3. Remake. If you've seen this cover before, thinking it's a spin-off or just another game, you probably don't know it's actually a remake of the first Wild Arms. It was released in 2003 in Japan, but Sony had little to no interest in its localization. Even though it was announced back then, it kept getting delayed. That is until a company called H-Tech brought it over on November 15 of 2005. It was never released in Europe. This remake featured full 3D graphics, remixed soundtrack, new music, the encounter cancel system seen in other Wild Arms games, new characters, expanded story, and even some of the characters from the original could now join your party. Most dungeons even had completely different puzzles and layouts. So, is this remake worth it? Yes, definitely! In some areas it may be even better than the original. Problem is, it's too expensive and rare. It barely sold any copies in both Japan and North America, primarily because H-Tech wasn't a big company like Working Designs or Exit Games, who later localized Wild Arms 4 and 5, and those weren't exactly big companies either. So with little to no interest from Sony and little advertisement from H-Tech, this remake quickly became a hidden gem, selling only 100,000 copies in both regions. Number 2. Commercial demise. Wild Arms was a commercial success worldwide, selling 950,000 copies in all regions. If we add the sales numbers of its digital re-release on the PSN many years later, it's safe to say it has sold over 1 million copies already. Wild Arms 2 sold 670,000 copies, but only between Japan and North America. The game was never released anywhere else, not even its digital re-release. Wild Arms 3 did get a worldwide release and a digital re-release on the PS4. It has sold 620,000 copies worldwide. Despite being very successful, Sony was disappointed with sales not reaching up to the massive success that had been the first game. So compared to these 3 games, the remake, Wild Arms 4, Wild Arms 5, and that spin-off called XF on the PSP, barely sold anything. The 4th game sold only 140,000 copies. The 5th one sold 400,000, but the majority of those numbers came from Japan. The point is, the series started selling less and less right after the release of the first game. Sony, being the type of company that it is, considered most of those numbers as disappointing, and eventually discontinued the series after the critical and commercial failure of Wild Arms Crossfire on the PSP. Number 1. The real reason why the series died. Wild Arms didn't come back until September 26 of 2018 with a mobile crossover. It was called A Million Memories, exclusive for phones, only in Japan! Feel Gaia is ruined and the main characters of each Wild Arms after 2, think Rudy, the protagonist of Wild Arms 1, is involved. The gameplay revolves around gacha features and a gameplay based on quests with real-time combat. The gacha system is there for the player to obtain arms or other equipment. Now, this wasn't developed by Mediavision, who was now working for Sega on the Valkyria Chronicle series. Forward Works made it, and while it did meet some success in Japan at first, less than 2 years later the game was shut down completely. Sony's lame attempt to bring back the series stayed in Japan with once again an unsuccessful game, one that its audiences overseas never got and never even cared for. And although Wild Arms 2 and 3 sold very well, Sony never saw it that way, which means they only consider the first game as a success, a game that slowly walked the sad road to total oblivion. And that's why the series died, because Sony's expectations were always up to the roof, because Wild Arms, sadly, couldn't compete with the big ones out there like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest. Wild Arms is more of a cult classic nowadays. Its initial success earned it a well-deserved spot in the history of JRPGs, but it was the same history that buried it in the sands of the same wastelands every revision of Gaia lived through. Fortunately for its fans, it's still the most popular game in the series. Sony may have given up, or may have forgotten about it, but not Mediavision, and definitely not its loyal fans. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!